Build Right is the educational division of Sparkbox, working to inspire and empower a web built right. For more information about Build Right or to have one of our workshops at your company or event, check out buildright.io. If you'd like to have Sparkbox help you make your web better, visit csparkbox.com. You're watching Tim Kadlec's Build Right Maker Series on performance budgets from April 23rd of 2015. The Build Right Maker Series is brought to you by the folks at Sparkbox and these generous sponsors. DataYard, performance-driven cloud hosting for kick-ass websites and applications. Campaign Monitor, a simple and elegant email marketing software for business. Shopify, a hosted, theme-based e-commerce platform. Harvest, simple time tracking, professional invoicing, powerful reporting software. Additional thanks to our secondary and giveaway sponsors for their help in making the Build Right Maker Series possible.
All right, so we spent most of this stuff right now has been kind of building up and laying the groundwork for thinking about performance budgets and how to do it. Now we're going to actually get into, let's start making a performance budget that you can actually start to use on your stuff. So if you were waiting for more into actually getting those metrics and picking them and then using them in their projects, this is where we're at now. So how fast is fast enough is probably the single most common question that I get asked about performance budgets. And what I would like to tell you is that it is as fast as possible, and that's it, and we can walk away and the performance budget workshop is done. But, you know, people actually, it turns out, want to be a little bit more specific for some reason. So, there's a few ways of looking at this. The one thing to do is to look at these response time limits that were identified actually as early as 1968, and then reconfirmed in 1991, and then Jacob Nielsen made them super popular sometime in the early 90s by writing about them. But these were response time limits that were identified in a series of studies in terms of how people interact with digital interfaces. They found that a delay of 100 milliseconds or less feels instantaneous to the person using the digital interface. So if I tap a button and the button changes or kind of bounces in or whatever you call that effect, if that happens within 100 milliseconds, it feels instant to me. Anything over 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second, anything under that, I'm still in a state of flow. So if anybody's read the book Flow or is familiar with the concept, flow is, like you're at your desk and you're doing programming and then you look up and it's like 7 o'clock at night and you have no idea, where the time went. We're in a state of flow. If that's happened, or maybe it's not that, maybe it's something else, maybe you never get in a flow in programming, which would be sad, but I mean there's other ways you could do it. Flow, they're very connected to their experience. They're very focused on what they're doing. If you go over 1 second in terms of the delay, it starts to break that flow in their concentration. There's another limit, which is 10 seconds, and at 10 seconds you've completely lost them. But if you get to 10 seconds on page load, then you have some big problems. So we're not going to worry about that from a budget perspective at all. So what we're concerned about are these instantaneous feelings in the state of flow. Out of this, I wrote a post fast enough, and this is the first time this has ever happened to me, and the only time it's ever happened to me. I was pretty pleased with the post. And then Paul Irish came in, and Paul made a comment on the post, which has been read more than the post at this point. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure that there's like 90% of the people who land on that page have no idea what the rest of it says. They've just zeroed in on Paul's thing. But Paul came in and said, I say it should be a speed index of less than or equal to 1,000. And this is derived partly off of these response times. And he's like, this is what you should be targeting for your performance budget. And this has actually become probably the gold standard. And I like this as a gold standard target. I think this is an awesome target. That's why I said 676 for the Maker Series is great. Because if you're hitting this 1,000 or underneath, you're providing a very snappy experience. I love this. I do think that it's potentially overkill if you're just getting rolling, though. And I used this the other day when I was asked about this, and I'm going to use the same story because I thought it worked out okay. I don't exercise. I'm lazy. I like to play basketball, though, a lot. I used to exercise in high school to play basketball so that I wasn't, so I could do it. And I started playing basketball again recently, like in a couple hours every morning, or every Friday morning. And I realized very quickly that I can no longer just get by on the fact that I'm young. I'm getting to the point where now there's people running loops around me pretty bad, and I'm gassed, halfway through the first game. So I decided I was going to start running to get back into shape. Now, my wife is much smarter than I am, and she said, take it easy. You haven't run for like 5-6 years. Don't kill yourself. You should probably just, run a little bit, walk a little bit, like the Couch to 5K sort of program. Ease into it. And I'm like, I have too much pride for that. I'm like, no way. I used to run a lot. I'm still young-ish, and I'm still relatively in shape. I can do this. So I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go out and I'm going to run, and I'm not going to run a long ways. I'm going to go for like a little over a mile. That's my goal. Run a little over a mile and come back and be good. So I did, and I died. I literally could not walk the rest of the day, and my shins and everything were just killing me for like a week. It was horrible. And then I never ran again. I didn't. That was the end of my workout program. It was one and done. But the reason why is because it was really discouraging, right? It was something I wasn't really conditioned to do. I wasn't in any shape to do, and I tried to go all at once for something that I thought would be a really awesome thing to be able to do right away. And as a result, I felt I got really discouraged. I got really burned out by it, and I never ended up going back to it. I think that's the risk of going for this right away if you are not already in a situation where performance is a big part of your culture, or it's something that you have a lot of people invested in already. Particularly if you're trying to iterate on a site that you have existing, and you're not starting fresh, but you have an existing site out there that you spend a lot of time in and you want to improve performance, and you're like, this performance budget stuff sounds great, I'm going to hit this. This can cause burnout and dissension and anger, and it's going to be very hard to stick. So I think a more conservative target for those scenarios comes from a little bit of science by Stephen Seow. Wrote a book called Designing and Engineering Time, which is all about the psychology of time as it pertains to software and digital interfaces. It's very good. One of the things he talks about in that book is called the 20% rule. And the idea with the 20% rule is that people notice differences in time when it corresponds to digital interfaces when the difference in time is 20% or greater. So if you have a site that loads in 10 seconds and you cut 1 second off, 9 seconds, most people aren't going to be able to tell that it's faster. Nobody's going to sit there and be like, oh, it's so much faster now. When you get it to 8 seconds, though, that's when it starts to reach that perception limit. Now, if you put an 8-second and a 10-second site next to each other, like one after the other, people will be able to tell that one is significantly faster than the 10-second one. It's that 20% rule is what you want to target. You can apply this to start making conservative targets for you to go after for your performance budget. So when I do this, I start with the existing site and 10 to 12 competitors. It's a decent sample size. You can get really obnoxious with this if you want, or you could trim it down. Honestly, 2 competitors is better than none, that kind of thing. But 10 to 12, it seems to be a pretty decent amount. And I do performance analysis on this and then start to use my 20% rule applied. So, web page test. Web page test requires an API key for any of the tooling that you would use. API keys are actually freely available since like December, instantly, through this page here. You enter in your information, you'll get an email right away. You confirm the email, and they'll give you an API key, so you can feel free to do that right now if you want one, and if you want to follow along with some of the tools that are going to be coming up. It's limited to like 200 hits, I think, per day, which, as long as you're not doing like super extensive research, 200 is probably going to be just fine for a lot of your projects. You can also request one directly from Pat at Web Page Test, but that's a longer process because he has to manually be like, yeah, okay, you can get it. And you get a higher limit in that case, but if you want it done and running, like, do this. The other route can sometimes take, however long it takes Pat to get through his inbox. And we all know how great it is to get to inbox 0 and how long that takes for most of us. I don't know about you guys, I've got a few hundred. I'm pretty bad at it. But you use this API key, and this API key you can use on a whole variety of tools that will help you with the performance budget process. One, which just came out very recently, is called Web Page Test Mapper. Web Page Test Mapper is a command line tool. It sits on top of the Web Page Test API, and it lets you do bulk testing of a variety of different URLs. So what you do is you define the URLs you want to test in a little JSON file. By default, it's test.json, but you can specify a different name in your thing. So in this case, I'm just doing a little bit of performance analysis on my page, Steve Sodders, and the filament group. And you flag them as home being yours, or away being, you know, a competitor's site, and that's just going to kind of alter how it shows up in the results. You can get really long with this. You know, 3 was just a simple short thing while I was experimenting with it, but you could have like 30, 40 if you really wanted to. And then you send a line through your command line like this. You call web page test map. You use the mapper. Now there's 3 mappers. The mapper, what it does is it takes the JSON results from web page test. It gives you the data, the results for those tests, and it maps those to some sort of output. There are 3 different kinds of output. One is the ODF spreadsheet, which will give you an actual spreadsheet of the results, which can be super nice for the performance budget analysis. By default, it gives you you know, these metrics in the 90th percentile and 10th percentile, but you can change this template. It's just an XML template. So you could change this to have it automatically create your 20% target on the fly, or to include other metrics inside of there. But this will generate a spreadsheet that you can plug into Google Spreadsheets, Excel, whatever your, you know, Open Office, whatever you happen to use for spreadsheets. That's one mapper for the results. Another mapper is the HTML distribution, I think is the one. There's 2 HTML ones. One of them does a bunch of, no, the distribution's another one. Distribution is a bunch of SVG charts that plots all sorts of things. Interesting from an analysis perspective, I guess. For our purposes, performance budget, it's not particularly the most useful of the 3 mappers, so I'm not actually, you know, don't really use it much. This is the other one, which actually charts out the results for you. And you can see that it used home to figure out that I should be flagged as a different color than my competitors. And it gives me the summary, but it also does a series of charts below in terms of speed index and other metrics so that I can see at a glance how I stack up compared to these other competing sites. So Web Page Test Mapper is it's super nice. It's pretty easy to use once you get it going. I would say that it's very brand new within the last week. And in fact, I think it was 2 days ago is when I actually started to really dive into it to see what it was good for. And even then, there were a few quirks that we were, you know, working out. It still has one issue where every once in a while it doesn't plot things. It's something to keep your eye on because I think it's very handy. Like I do the chart analysis during a performance audit all the time. Having it automated through something like this would be very, very nice. I think it's, you know, because this to me, when you're doing a performance audit, which we can talk about maybe in the afternoon or a little bit later in this session, but if you're doing a performance audit to present to somebody about yours versus competitors, like having charts that kind of show in a very visual perspective, like how you stack up to others is pretty helpful. So this is nice from that perspective. The spreadsheet is great for performance, you know, budget testing. It works awesome. At the moment, though, my tool of choice is actually Web Page Test Bulk Tester, which is from Andy Davies. And this one you could follow along pretty easily if you have a Google Docs account or you know, any sort of Google account. And it's pretty straightforward to use. You can actually like grab the script and install it that way. Or within that GitHub page, he has a link where you just click off to the spreadsheet and make a copy for yourself, which works, I think, probably a little better. Here, let's do. All right. This would be the bulk tester. So actually within his thing, and he's got a detailed post too because I bothered him long enough to make him do it because I'm like, dude, you got to document this. Nobody knows. It's very cool. So right here, if you just follow this link, you can actually make a copy of it from there. And make your series budget. Make your series budget. Boom. And that's pretty much it. So we'll kind of walk through a little bit of this. It's fairly straightforward once you get used to it. Like he's got the steps here. you've got these tabs down here are what drive it. So if you go to your settings, you can see that this here is the web page test server you're hitting. So if you've got a private install, you would be hitting your private install here. If you're using the public version of web page test, you've got the web page test address that you would just be pumping in, webpagetest.org. Your API key that you got from that service or from Pat would go here. And I just happen to have one through the Magic Television, or however that works. How do they do that on cooking shows? Something like that. There we go. The server config, so that's basically it for that. It's very straightforward. For the map of columns, this section here about the scenarios tab to the web page test API parameters. The web page test API is well documented in terms of the parameters. There's parameters you can use for how many times you have a test, what connection, what device, what browser. All of that stuff is programmatically, you can put that in. By default, he's just using location, runs, record video, and do first view only, which works fine for our purposes of just kind of demoing it. But if you wanted to, and that's in the scenarios tab, which you'll see line up to the column names. So name, location, runs, video, first view only. And those relate to the web page test parameters. And you just define the values here. So here we've got two possible scenarios that we might be testing under. We might be testing using Chrome cable or Firefox cable. And we could get dramatically different on either of them. We could add a mobile connection here, which I usually do for performance budget analysis, as well as another scenario. And you just add as many columns as you want to tailor how those results are going to come back to you. Then you also map the columns in the test tab to what the results are. Again, for what he has here, it's perfectly fine. We're going to get speed index back, load time, requests, those sorts of things. And again, that shows up as column headers on your test tab. Your test tab is where you enter all the URLs you want to test. So he's got, by default, the BBC stuff. Obviously, you put what you want there. So what this looks like when I'm using it is this looks like the current site that we're actually going to be rebuilding or improving on, as well as the 10 to 12 competitors. Those URLs go in here for each scenario we want to test. We usually test multiple pages, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but basically if you're a cooking site, you might want to test your home page, a recipe page, and a category page like grilling or something like that to get a decent representation, because those pages may differ in terms of the content on there. Or like a news site, BBC might want to test their home page. They may also want to test like a video page or a news article page, key page templates. Find representative, I can't talk, but that's cool. Find pages that find pages that are representative, that was perfect, of where a lot of the traffic's going to come, of those key templates, and plug those in. And with all of that there, you just can go back to the how to use thing if you want to, but you're basically just, there's now a little web page test option here from the script, and you are running the tests. And it says running, except it needs authorization, so I've got to authorize. I'm going to authorize it here and be like, yeah, cool, let's do it. Let's make it happen. Okay, now do I need to resubmit or not? Okay, you only need to authorize the first time when you've actually done the thing. So there, now you see it's got this little pop-up, it's submitting the tests. And it's returning statuses. So the statuses relate to the web page test API 400. The status numbers give different amounts in terms of what's been submitted, if it's in progress, if the results are coming back. And what it's doing is it's refreshing in the background this entire time every, a couple seconds. I'm not exactly sure exactly what he has that set to. But it should be continually looking to see if those things are changing. If you get paranoid, you can always say get results, which will try out and fetch whatever the current version of these things are. Actually, I think I screwed this up, though. Yep, let's kill that. So now let's, And if it doesn't work, we're just going to fall back on the, I've got a pre-baked version here, because live demos never work for me. What's that? Yeah, yeah. Is that easier? Is that better?
Yeah.
No problemo. Invalid. So what's it telling us here? Invalid location. So maybe I did still missed something wrong. That's right. Maybe we have to go back to our tests. Do that. Do that. Do. All right, so I'm having no luck here. I've got something wrong in terms of my settings. So we're going to go to our rebaked, our existing one here. Which? Say that again?
I don't think Dublin is a look. I think it's saying the
Oh, you're right. You're absolutely right, in fact. Yep, solid point. So this is why we have people out there to fact check me. These locations here, we've got the Dublin Chrome and Dublin Firefox location, particularly with the web page test get key. These keys are also restricted to certain areas, and the location that we've specified is incorrect. It'll take me just a second here. I am not a robot. Gravy. And what we're going to do, though, is, I'm sorry, guys, I got to kill the mirroring because I might have incriminating emails. So I actually have no idea what's in there. It's scary. I did that several times. I was like a workshop, and we jumped off into the browser, and I forgot to switch mirroring on. So the entire time that I was doing it, nobody pointed out that like I wasn't really paying attention, and they were looking at my inbox the entire time. It was great. Okay. You can't see the email that I'm looking at, but if you filled this out yourself, you already have seen this stuff. But basically, the email tells you that these are the locations you can use for the testing under this key. I say free key. I guess it's more immediate key, because the key is always free. We're going to do this again. Or no, we're not. Key is always free. It's just that it gets processed quickly if you do it this way. So we're going to grab a location out of here. And we're going to come back to our budget. Turn back mirroring so that I don't, that's fine. And we're going to do this. So that's an actual location we can run and make sure that our tests are using, let's ditch this scenario, use our Chrome cable scenario. Let's update just to be safe. Thank you, script. And now let's see if we can run it without getting a 400 error and actually showing you guys something. There we go. That's much better. Okay, so 101 means it's actually 101 means it's actually submitted. Already we've got a web page test ID. If you were to follow one of these things out, you'd see that it's in the process of running. Oh, look. That's nice. We're going to get to this task in actually just a few minutes, the grunt perf budget thing. That was, yeah, that wasn't intentional, but it works. Works. So as these things are running, what it's going to do is it's going to continue to update. Eventually, these statuses, once it gets to the top of the queue, are going to start to change. We're going to start to see that we're hopefully getting results, unless the error is on the URL side, like BBC News is down or something. And as those results, you can see that one changed already. As the results come in, it's going to start to fill in all of these different columns. Time to first byte, render start, speed index, request, all of those sorts of things. In this case, because we were trying to be quick, we're only doing 2, but this is a huge time saver if you're doing the competitive analysis, because if you're doing 2 or 3 page templates for 12, 13 sites, you know, submitting these all at once and just letting it sit there and come back with the results it's fantastic. I used to bulk test and then shove things into the spreadsheet, and it was a lot longer process. It's very nice. And we may have to wait a little bit, which is, oh no, there we go. We should get some results here pretty quick. And like I said, when you're getting, you can force it to there we go, force it to fetch. And you can see, so now for the first time that we're running, it's got all the results for us here in terms of what those numbers are, the speed index, the requests. We have the full link to the page results so we can do deeper analysis if we want. But for a performance budget purpose, this is awesome because now if we're doing, say, say we want to get the target for our speed index based on this, you can just do a little formula and have that repeat all the way down that column, and now we've got a target speed index that we should be going after. So you can see it makes the performance budget analysis very quick for any metric really that you're recording. So I like to do that to get my bulk testing going. And what? This was my fallback in case that completely failed, which it almost did. But at the end of the day, you can end up with something like this, which is a very long thing. This isn't even 10 to 12. This was like 6 or 7. This was a budget we did for Radio Free Radio Europe, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, when we were doing their analysis. We did a variety of pages and representative pages for them in similar sites. And we ended up just having the formulas calculate the targets based on that 20% for start render, visually complete, fully loaded. This is one of those cases where we didn't use speed index because they weren't in a position where web page test was going to work for them, similar to what you had expressed earlier with not being able to set it up inside a nationwide perhaps. It was a similar thing. So without that tooling in place, speed index didn't make sense, so we decided to do a combination of milestone timings. For that budget, most of their people visiting their site are coming on mobile devices. They're hitting a lot of emerging areas where that is the dominant platform. So we focused primarily on slow 3G connections to determine our budget. And we chose a few representative things like the home page and an article page, and I think a video page was used as well. The bulk tester ran through that, automatically did all the performance budget analysis. We just picked the targets out of that based on whatever the most conservative target was at the time. And we came to a budget of about visually complete in less than or equal to 4,000 milliseconds. Now, this is, if you were paying attention, this is significantly slower than the human perception thing of 1,000 milliseconds, and it's certainly not a speed index of 1,000. This isn't great from that perspective. But getting back to the whole running analogy, this was an organization that had a really talented team, but it was a really talented team that hadn't had an opportunity or hadn't had the experience working at performance that closely before. So we were going after an easy win here. Lara Hogan talks about this a lot, about the value of getting those wins, getting those easy wins, and building up a culture slowly over time through that. It's something that they do inside of Etsy. It's something that Lara does personally whenever she does something, a career achievement, or she wrote a book, or she gives a keynote talk. She rewards herself with donuts. I love that. I love that idea of celebrating your wins. I love the fact that I love her focus on being super positive about this and taking those baby steps, and that's what we decided to do within that organization. We gave them a target that was going to be faster than their competitors, faster than their existing site, so a much better experience, but something that was realistic at the end of the day. And then they could hit that target, and they could continue to iterate on that target over time. That's the thing about performance budgets is you don't set it and then forget it. You set it and you continue to improve as long as you continue to see benefits that go along with it. And we'll talk about some tools that'll let you maintain that over time. Speaking of Lara, we're going to take a little segue. This is in her book, Designing for Performance, which is great, has a great chapter on culture and stuff. She gives an example of what a performance budget might look like as she saw it. And you can see that she's actually defining several different metrics. She's got speed index under mobile connections for the home page, speed index on a mobile connection for other pages, page weight, page load time. She's pairing a combination of them together. This gets back to what we were talking about in terms of this sort of continuum, in that each of these things, each of these metrics has different value and different purposes, and pairing them together gives you a lot of bang for your buck. Dan Moll wrote a blog post How to Make a Performance Budget, where he walks through this. And he walks through how do you get from point A to point B. So say you have a milestone timing, and how do you get from there to a weight that you can use to help inform design decisions early on. The way he does it is he takes his targets, so he's identified these 20% targets through some competitive analysis, so he knows what he wants for start render, document complete, and fully loaded. And then he just does a little bit of rough math, and I know that if you guys don't like, does anybody like math? Do I get more hands for math than reading? All right, I did, that's sad. All right, so some of you like math. The rest of us, that's why calculators were invented. These test results came back on a 3G connection with a 768 kilobits per second speed. Breaking that down to bytes, he figured out that's 96 kilobytes a second. So he did some fuzzy math here and said, okay, if we're targeting these numbers for our target time, that means we have roughly this amount of kilobytes that we can spend. If you're sitting there right now and thinking you're right that these are not entirely 100% accurate, right? Because you have latency on that network, the number of requests is going to significantly impact this. And like we've learned, this isn't very indicative of the actual user experience. But it actually, I think that this works. I think this works really well, and it certainly works very well for Dan. It gets him in the right ballpark, and it gives him a number that he can use as a designer that's much more easy for him and useful for him than speed index or whatever it happens to be. Because he can now do things like this. He can say, okay, I've got 114K to spend, so I've got these different kinds of assets I might use on my site, and if I break them out evenly, I've got this. And maybe my site actually doesn't need web fonts at all. Maybe it's a very image-heavy site, and so I start to shove some budget there. This doesn't mean that he's necessarily going to end up with 45, 46K of images and 22.8 of JavaScript and so on, but it gives him something to start ballparking as he's thinking about it. Like, okay, I've got to kind of keep things in line here in terms of how many images I'm using. Or if it's a very typographically heavy site, maybe I've got more to spend on my web fonts and ditch the images. He can play around with combinations as a designer that helps to set his expectations of how he's going to create and build this site. And he knows that if he gets this weight right, it may not be exactly what those targets are, but it's going to be close enough that we can start to move it. It's going to be in the right ballpark that we can tweak it enough in the development stages to get it under our experience-based metrics like our speed index or our user timings. So it's a very valuable step. Katie has written about this. She wrote about these alternatives to popular web typefaces for better performance, how having a budget, she then dove in and started comparing, like, how do you find equivalent fonts that maybe are a little less heavy? Things like Chaparral Pro versus Tisa Pro, and I don't know if I pronounced those right. I probably did not. But, they're pretty close. They have similar line heights. They look very similar, but one of them saves you almost 50K. So these are the things, this is where that quantity-based stuff comes into play really, really helpfully, is in that design area where it makes it so much more easy to understand like the implications of another font or another image or how you might guide the way you're going to design and lay out that page. So this is why I think that what Lara talks about in her book and putting them all together, I think is the absolute right way to do it, because it's going to give you so much more power and so much more bang for your buck and a much better understanding throughout your entire team. And we're going to jump into using the budget now that we've got it in a second, and it kind of pigtails off of this. Pigtails? That's fine. But that's not at all right, is it? I like to make things up when I'm yeah, that's cool. So but first, any questions on this sort of thing? Oh, this is horrible. Pigtails. Dovetails? That's right. Yeah, dovetails. Pigtails.
I love the detail that this provides, but I was thinking for mine, internal usage would be pretty easy to just do a baseline and then just say 20% would be the first goal, and then 20% improvement would be the next goal. 20%, 20%.
Yes.
Because it's a tangible, noticeable difference.
It is. It is.
So just do a snapshot of the baseline and just improve from there.
Yes, and that's basically what the analysis is doing, except with competitors thrown in. You're doing 20% of your existing site or 20% of the competitors. I usually throw the competitors in there. I think when you're starting out, in fact, I've talked to people who they've gone as far as saying that when they help people start with performance budgets for the first time in their organization, they go very conservative. They said that the best way for them to do it, in their experience, is find out what the current baseline is, and that's your performance budget. And you start there while you get the tooling and the processing in place to make sure that you're maintaining it and monitoring it. And once you've got those tools in place, then you start to shave your 20% off and keep going there. So I've seen people go super conservative with the baseline. I've seen people ditch the competitor analysis entirely, which is fine. Honestly, if you're doing that based on your site and you're right, it's going to be a better experience for the users, and it's a way to continue to improve. The reason I throw competitive analysis in there is a lot of the times when I'm doing this, it's up front on the organization as part of a larger performance audit or performance discussion that we're having, and sometimes the competitive analysis is the easiest way to get a lot of the backing on it. It's a lot, if I can say, you know what, Sports Illustrated, I didn't work with Sports Illustrated, but if I can say, hey, you know what, Sports Illustrated, ESPN is at this, and if you get to this point, you're going to be faster site than ESPN, sometimes that's an easier thing to get buy-in on because people don't like to lose to a competitor than it is to say, you know, let's improve the 20% there. So it depends on your scenario, but I have zero issues with your baseline 20%, 20%, 20%. Zero issues.
I remember, too, from the podcast with Laura, that she said something that really stuck out to me, which was that as Etsy, she's speaking from home, you know, as Etsy's traffic is shifting from, you know, desktop primarily views down to sort of more mobile traffic, that means that the web experience is actually getting slower, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because mobile browsers tend to be a little slower, right? The devices, all the latency issues, all that.
Yeah.
So like that's another thing to think in mind. Keep in mind, if you just say, hey, right now here's a snapshot, 20% off of this is my goal, but that might be really tough to do continually, right? If your traffic is shifting to devices, smaller devices, and those devices are generally slower, you're actually on the rise, you know.
So I think that's why it's so important to have a clearly defined scenario. Like you saw in her chart where she was clearly defining this is 3G, this is cable, this is whatever. Because if you're looking at it from a holistic, like entire perspective, you're right, the traffic, the conditions of the network and the way the traffic is moving towards mobile increasingly, that, you know, the RUM data, the real data that you're collecting is certainly going to shift in that opposite direction, which is going to make it very hard. But if you can say that this is our scenario, this is what we're identifying for our target in a 3G connection under these situations, then you can at least keep that level regardless of the level of your traffic. But I do recommend looking at the traffic to figure out where you're going to do the budget initially, because you can get as complex with this as you want. You could have one budget, which is probably going to be tough to do because for mobile, desktop, everything in between. You could have a budget defined for a 3G connection and a budget defined for a cable, which starts to break it out a little more. But you can get very granular with this and have separate budgets for separate pages and separate budgets for different networks, and, like, you know, have as many as you really want to get into. But your analytics is a big part of that. That's why Radio Free it wasn't even just a 3G connection that we used. We used the super slowest 3G connection we could simulate because that was closer to reality. They have a lot of countries that they're hitting where some of the most popular devices on those networks do not support Wi-Fi and do not support 3G connections. So the best you're going to get is a 2G network. And so we were trying to find something that was fairly representative of that without going like nuts, like we're going to adhere to your budget on a first generation, you know, thing with like 10,000 latency or whatever. You know, so we've tried to find something that was close to that experience without going overboard with it. And to be quite honest, one thing that we struggled with and we never really got to a full definitive, like this was the right move thing on, was how do we balance performance budgets for that scenario. We have the extremes of somebody on a mobile device on a 2G network, and maybe that's a old Nokia, or they could be sitting on a 2G network with an iPhone, or they could equally be using that iPhone on a Wi-Fi network. So that, like, we never quite got into the right analysis there. Like, do we need a separate budget for mobile on 2G and mobile on Wi-Fi, but you can't actually detect that sort of a thing very easily, programmatically, to kind of change the experience in that way. So we never quite settled on like how do you provide a high experience to the people in a situation to benefit from that without leaving out everybody else. I think that's an ongoing discussion that we continue to have. Outside of that, within the standards things too, there's a lot of interesting chatter about that. But anything else? Yes.
Do you have any way, and off the top of my head, I don't know that there is easy. So we sort of were able to use like Google Analytics and like traditional metrics to be able to build a business case around, 25% of our traffic is coming from mobile devices. Respond. It at least starts the conversation, right, around having a response and whatever that end result was. But if we wanted to start having a performance conversation, and I just can't. Okay, I say, well, we have 30% or 25% coming on mobile. How do I take that next step and say 80% of those people are on the cellular network? Or are there JavaScript? Or you just can't. And it's I don't know. I was just trying to think of.
If you're using something like some CDNs or some things that you could run on the server will detect that. There's a JavaScript property that they're playing around with, but is not, widely implemented. And honestly, nobody's sure if it should give you a specific this is the bandwidth or it's roughly a 3G connection. This is the bandwidth gets really difficult to track.
Yeah.
This is a 3G connection is almost too loose of an information because there could be 3G connections faster than a Wi-Fi and things like that. So tracking and specifically the network type is kind of messy. I would say that it's beneficial to take, Google Analytics will record the actual performance of sites in the real world. I would say that this, it's very useful to take real user monitoring from Google Analytics or New Relic or some source that does that versus web page test is synthetic. Synthetic is you're defining a scenario and you're testing in that scenario. Rum, real, is not just a tasty drink, but it's also a real user, which hopefully we'll be having some after. No, it's also it's real world. It's this is when people actually go to your site. It's tracking the data from real users to give you that. And if you look through your Rum data, you can get a pretty good picture of how things are really performing. It's not going to tell you network type, but it should kind of give you a hint of we're really, really slow for a high percentage of our users, and you can kind of maybe pinpoint what devices they're using off of that and try to give you a fuller picture that way. Yeah. Okay. There'll be more time. No, let's actually use the thing, right? Let's actually use the budget. This is, it's nice. We finally get to that. It's long-winded. There's a variety of different things that I think the budget is useful. We talked a little bit about informing design already in terms of how the designers might use that, design team might use that to identify where they're going to allocate their budget. This initially feels uncomfortable for a lot of people. If you have, if you go to a design team and you say you have $200K to spend on your new redesign, I hear laughing. No, it can be a painful shift for a lot of people. Frankly, it can be a painful shift for a lot of developers who are used to grabbing jQuery and every other plugin that they go on through. So let's not try to pin this all on the design team, folks. But we're going to get to the developers. No, but it can be difficult, but it's about embracing constraints. It's not a bad thing in any way. I think there's a lot of benefits to this. Does anybody, I know you guys don't read, but maybe when you were little, you guys are destroying my entire presentation. You guys, know what this is? Green Eggs and Ham? It's one of the greatest children's books of all time. It's fantastic. Dr. Seuss wrote this as a bet. He had a friend who said, I bet you can't write a book in 50 words or less, using 50 words or less. And Dr. Seuss said, you bet I can. And that's what this is. There's no more than 50 words inside of this book. That it was a constraint. And it turned out to be this wonderful, charming book that has led for, years, that people have been reading to their kids. And I read to my kids, and I'm sure that it's probably still going to be there when they're reading to theirs. And he did the whole thing within this incredibly constrictive constraint that a lot of people were like, you can't do that. Constraints are great. I'm going to quote Katie again. I keep calling on Katie, but she had some really great stuff to say about performance budgets. And she talked in a post that she wrote for Cognition. She said initially she worried that a budget would restrict her vision and suck the life out of any potentially totally awesome ideas she may have had. But, as us designers do, she learned to love the challenge of solving a problem within a set of strict parameters. And I love this because this is exactly what you want to have happen. And this is what eventually does happen, I think, in most cases. You get used to that, and as part of the experience that you're building for, it's another component of creating an excellent web experience. And when you get to that point, it stops being like, a problem. It starts being something that's helping you inform your design and helping you create something that's much more suitable and effective for the web experience than what you were doing before. Or going to the Radio Free project, which I worked on with Dan Moll. Dan, who is going to be doing a Maker Series thing later on, which they pushed, which you should totally do, not just for the prize, but because Dan is a very smart, nice guy. He has this thing called Element Collage. It's an early design deliverable that he does where he doesn't do a full-page mockup. He shoves a bunch of different components that might show up at some point throughout the site in a huge, huge document. So the idea is you're thinking in terms of like the system and the patterns instead of singular pages. And it's one of the very first deliverables that he provides on a project. We came into this thing with a performance budget very clearly defined early on and a lot of research into the performance scenario ahead of any design work. And it started to inform design this early already. If you look at this section here where he's exploring fonts or type, I don't know what the right term is. Words and how they look. There's a lot of words on, it's a news site, and reading is a huge part of the experience, and that provides a lot of the personality and sets the tone for a lot of what they're reading, so it's incredibly important to get right. Dan right away started to experiment with using which web fonts might look great, but we all know web fonts, right, have a little bit of a limitation. Sometimes they have some issues. So he was also considering what happens in the fallback. What happens in a scenario where we have to do something different from a performance perspective to allow for a different network or a different type of device or to fit within our budget if we start to get into that situation. So he looked for fallback fonts that were widely supported and had similar line heights, X heights, and similar weights to them and a similar look and feel so that we knew what we were going to do in those situations. It also informed how he designed the article page with a video embed. He started to look at this in terms of a core experience, an enhanced experience, and then how that kind of tailors up as you're getting onto larger screens. But again, this was all around the idea of, on that core experience, that we have to simplify for maybe a slower network to make sure we're hitting our budget and getting things out there quickly. Maybe we don't embed we don't have the image directly there. We've just got a link and a little bit of an icon pushing out to it. This was the very first design deliverable he did, and already performance and the implications of what we had identified in the budget and the analysis was already informing in very impactful ways how Dan was thinking about designing this site. We then used it to inform development, because we don't get off the hook either as developers. We have our own little things we like to hang on to. We used Pattern Lab for this, which if you guys were at Brad's thing. Brad did the atomic design thing. I'm sure he talked about Pattern Lab. Inside of Pattern Lab, we wrote a little bit of a script using navigation timing to shove page load time in every single page that was, so it displays in the admin toolbar on every single page that we go to. Even on individual components, it's constantly there in that top right corner. What it does is it's just taking some navigation timing and comparing it to a budget that we've defined. And if we're over budget, it goes red. And if we're under budget, it's green like you see here. So the result is that as we're working on this and we're writing the HTML and writing the CSS and writing the JavaScript, every single time we hit that refresh button, we are constantly reminded, even if it's just at a glance, that we're under budget or we're over budget. There's no escaping it. It's always sitting there. And you can get very obnoxious with this if you wanted, but the simple red and green worked very well for us. It's a super simple script. This would work if you use this and replace the comments with something. But the idea is you're just grabbing the window.performance object and the timing stuff inside of there, which is what holds all of those things we talked about in that chart, the navigation start, connection end, and things like that. And it's sort of a brute force budget, but you can grab when the navigation start, like when did everything kick off with this page, and look at the time now at the bottom of the page, and you've got yourself a rough approximation of how long it took to load. And then you can compare that to a budget and just shove an element within your page and give it a class and style it however you want. Super simple, it works. This is actually a little bit more fleshed out. There is I did do a gist, did I make that private? No. There's a gist, which is basically what we used. We used it inside of Pattern Lab, so we had to hook into some other things there. But it's basically what it is. And you could bulletproof it more. You could get more, in cases where navigation timing wasn't supported, you could fall back to something. But because we were doing this for our development environment, and our primary development environment was inside of modern browsers. I mean, we certainly tested for sure on the other ones, but when we were writing code, it was usually, with Chrome or Firefox or whatever happened to be open. This worked for us. If you don't like the little indicator, you don't like the simplicity of the script, that's fine. I won't be hurt. There's a thing called PerfBar, which works really well. It's up on GitHub as well, so freely available. What it does is it shoves this little bar. I've tapped to expand it, but it's actually just that first top part of it that sits on the bottom of your screen, and it collects all sorts of metrics, which you see here, and it's comparing each of those against a budget, which is why some are red and some are green. So you can get a lot more metrics if you wanted to and have a lot more involved interface there. The only critique I would have of PerfBar is if I was using it primarily on a project, I would tweak the CSS and one line in the JavaScript. I would have it add a over budget class or something like that to the header so that when it's just that header part here, it was still red or green, because I like that visual indication right away. With it collapsed and without any change in over budget or under budget, it's still kind of easy to ignore. So I would try to give that a specific color. But it's another way of constantly keeping tabs on every single page load. This is an idea that I completely stole from Etsy. Etsy did a presentation in where they kind of showed in passing almost that they have this admin bar that they use on all their development, and one of the things is a performance thing. I don't know if they had specific budgets, but they produced a little timeline, pretty little timeline that gave them an indication of how quickly things performed. But I love this. Having this constantly there through development makes performance impossible to ignore. And then we enforced it, because it's not just enough to have the stuff there for you to look at and keep tabs on. We humans are fantastic people, beings, animals, creatures. We're smart. We do a lot of super cool things. But we're also the people who once thought that these things were so cool that even The Rock was wearing them. We're also the creatures who thought the disco was in any way acceptable, like this is an acceptable dance move. And we are the people and the creatures who thought that, yes, owning a pet rock would be such a good idea that we bought 1.5 million of them in the first 6 months that they were out. Because that makes sense. So in other words, we've been known to, our judgment has been called, it could legitimately be called into question a time or two in the past. So I like to always have some sort of automated thing as well, just making sure that machines checking on us to make sure we're not getting a little out of hand. To that end, I wrote Grunt Perf Budget, which is a grunt task that sits on top of the web page test API. Honestly, the web page test API does all of the hard work. But yeah, we have this running inside of our build process, and it lets us define a budget in a scenario that we're testing through web page test. So in this case, we have a budget of visually complete 4,000. We're doing it over a 3G connection. What URL we're testing, we use the public instance in this case. You could have a private instance just as well. You run this task whenever you want. We did it on a formal build process. If you do it as like a watch perpetual thing, it takes a while because it's got to ping out to web page test, wait for the test to run, and get the results back. It slows everything down. So we have it as a deliberate step. So when we go to actually do a formal deploy or a formal build, this task runs as part of that, and if this task fails, it destroys our build. We can't go anywhere. So we've got to address the issue first. It's harsh, but you can be more lenient if you want, but I like this because it makes sure that we can't do anything. This is, I don't know exactly how they do it, but I know that Google does something similar with a lot of their builds. They will not let things go live if they do not perform below a certain threshold. So it's a harsh way of enforcing it. Because this is on the web page test API, there's a lot of things you can do. You can spit the output into a JSON file so that you could save that output over time and graph it using something like Graphite, so you can kind of keep historical data of how things are going throughout your build process. You can do whatever you want with it. You can do user timing. So if you have a specific custom mark that you're setting in user timing on your page, like we talked about for like an image loading or something like that, it'll track that user timing and record it in web page test, and you can have a budget defined on that. And of course, you can get crazy with your budget and just add as many different things as you want. Bytes in is, how heavy is the page, so that would be our quantity-based metric. Milestone timing and visual complete and speed index, and have all of them enforced all at once within the build process. If any one of those things fails, the task fails. We get a summary result where we can dive into the web page test results and see why did we go over budget, what's the problem there, and we can't go anywhere until we fix it. And hooking this into some sort of a continuous integration system like Jenkins or Travis, if it's on GitHub, Travis is super slick for setting up. We'll actually, destroy those builds or do things like if you have a pull request, it'll flag it as broken, so you know ahead of time that, something went off here. It's a really valuable, we found it to be very valuable, and I found it since to be very valuable in our development process to make sure that we don't accidentally lose sight of things, because we can't. Unless we go in there and explicitly turn it off, there's no way around it.
We do a lot of TDD, so it's like test-driven development, and we run cucumber scripts and things like that. Have you seen anybody do an integration for like official testing, to have any of this stuff in the performance built into that?
Into their continuous integration system?
More like cucumber scripts, when testers are actually running through scripts for the website, maybe they can actually run performance. I haven't seen anything, but
I haven't seen anything like that. I think there's people doing things that are trying to allow them to do a little bit more of a test-driven thing, kind of in spirit. Filament Group does, their setup is they've got their own little thing that they built that where they push up. They've got a different branch. It pushes up to a different URL so that they can test, for example, criticalcss.mysite.com versus non-critical or whatever it is. It'll create a separate URL per branch so they can actually test and experiment through web page test within a certain scenario and see what has changed and if the value has, if it's better or worse. Like for their fonts, they talk a lot about fonts. They do a lot of that sort of experimentation. You could do things like that. I don't know that I've known of anybody doing any specific like cucumber scripts or anything like that, though. I don't know. If there are, I'd love to hear about it. So if you dig into it and you find out otherwise, or if I find out otherwise, I'll ping you, but that'd be cool. It's one of those things where I think people are, there's a lot of companies that are curious about it and exploring it and working on it, so I wouldn't be surprised if that's there relatively soon. When the first time I wrote about the thing was in 2012, and there was nothing. Like, I wrote it in passing because I had no idea how to do it. I was like, this is a good idea and we should do this, but there was nothing there, and like now there's a million options for everything. There's sitespeed.io is a service that has a command line interface that'll do a lot of performance budgeting checks that you can do as well. You can build into your gulp or grunt process or whatever it is. Phantomus, I think, is the name of one that does very similar things and tries to record it over time. There's a lot of different options. For the rule-based metrics, I also like to have PageSpeed Insights running within the process. There's a specific grunt and gulp task for this, but this is the underlying node module. And if you run this from your command line just to get a feel for what it's doing, it's giving you the results back on a specific URL and all of those scores. And inside of those tasks, you can define thresholds for those scores and break your build on that if you want. So if you've got, you want speed index of 1,000 and you've got page speed, you want to make sure that you're hitting, a static size below something or the score of, 85 or plus instead of the 64. You could enforce that as well. The threshold default, as you can see at the bottom, is actually 70, but you can custom define that to be however high you want. So if you're not happy with being a C student, you can push on up. Is 70 a C? It's a C. And this is an example of having it build, break in with like what a Travis integration might do in terms of the pull request that coming into a repo or something like that. It's going to say, uh-oh, it kind of failed. Be careful if you're going to manually do this. Like, you could technically overwrite it, but you have to make that conscious decision that you're going to ignore the performance versus just forgetting about it. Going on in the future, that's during development. Now, if you do, hey there, hello. Oh, I see what I did. That's fine. Here we go. Going on in the future, you want to be able to maintain this over the long haul. Those things help with your development process. But once you go live, you also want to keep tabs on things just to make sure things aren't weird or off. And that's where continuous monitoring helps. One of my favorite options, because it's super easy to set up and it's nice, it's backed on web page test, and it's actually designed well, which is a rare thing for performance tooling, is speed curve. So speed curve will actually hit web page test results over time and track those things so I can keep tabs on how things have been going. It collects the results. I can dig into a specific test if I want. Like if I see, for example, why on earth is this test, why is my DOM complete jumping or whatever it is, I can jump into that stuff. I got the film strip view. I can see why my content requests are changing over time. I have no idea why I would have had 5 image requests ever, but that's freaky. So you can keep tabs on that, but the best thing is they recently added this budget ability. So you can define a budget for all sorts of different metrics. And that's that red line. In this case, the budget is 300K for the total size of the page. I am extremely well below that. But if it goes above that line, it would alert you. You could have it email you, you could have it notify you, or run some sort of a task, hit a webhook of some sort so that it automates some sort of reporting or tooling. So that that if things have gone haywire, you get an alert and you have to jump into it and look at it. And you can do that with speed index because it's web page test, so you get the reporting of that. And you can define these things inside of the benchmark area. Nope, not inside of the benchmark area, ignore me. Inside of the settings area. So, budgets and alerts. So, he's got these are page types that I have defined. I have a home, archive, post, whatever. And I can choose the metric that I want to use. So if I wanted to say set a start render time threshold of 2 seconds. Oh, let's do that. And I could have it send me emails or send off, like I said, pinged webhooks, however I want it to do. You can also define notifications if it changes within a certain percentage. So even if it doesn't go over your budget, but it suddenly jumps by like 15%, and you want to know why, it'll let you know. And then when you do that and you go back to your results, you'll now see that there is a panel for start rendering time. And that I am over budget on significantly. I have to work on that server. But you can see, so these are the results, and here's the budget line is actually below that. So all of this stuff that's flagged as kind of this reddish color is bad news. And I'm probably going to start getting a whole bunch of emails, so I'm going to turn this off after we're done with this. But because I don't want to get too annoyed. But it's an incredible tool, and it's something that it's been used on large companies too. It's not just something, it looks great. Its simplicity, I think, of use and the design is almost deceiving. But people like The Guardian and other large companies have used this as their primary monitoring system. It's fantastic. So, and I'm sure that Steve Sodders just went there and they're exploring all sorts of new metrics, and Mark Zeman, the guy who created it, is all about trying to find better ways of visualizing performance and unique ways of doing it so that it's more understandable, and it gets away from your typical lesser designed experience that you see from a lot of the other performance tools available to you. So I like this. So it doesn't have to be speed index. I like speed index because it's got the budget stuff built in and because it looks nice and it's easy to use. But it doesn't have to be this, but having some sort of ongoing monitoring system letting you know once things go live if things are changing too. So if something leaks through deployment or something has a significant change from some sort of a third-party asset or whatever it happens to be, you're going to get alerted to it if you've got something in place like this. And if you can take this a step further and try to tie this to your business analytics, and then you can actually pinpoint when changes in performance tied back to things like revenue or bounce rates or things like that, so you can continue to make the case that you should be improving that and iterating on that. Now let's do merge with caution. So that's speed curve, which I am a big fan of. Any questions on using it, enforcing it, what it does for an informing? Any concerns, any things that you think I oversimplified, which is totally fair. I see you're thinking about it again. That's fine. Do it, fire.
Thinking of another industry option or opportunity as web developers approaching the new business services, saying I can not only improve your site, I can guarantee performance, and you can measurably, and if not, then you'll be notified, and if it's pay for service, then you pay for the service that you get. I mean, I don't know, it's something that it could be a new,
That's interesting.
new service.
Yeah. So are you saying, like, do you pay for a certain level of performance on the service?
Possibly. Or I guarantee that I can come to your site as it is, and I can work on performance,
Mm-hmm.
and increase it X amount based upon
Yes.
the agreed upon budget, and we can monitor that over time. And if I underperform, you can monitor it, and if I perform, then you underpay me.
Sure. There's a lot of value in being able to measure and monitor that stuff directly. I know that some companies have put those performance, like they've developed performance budgets for their third-party resources and put those in service level agreements in their SLAs and said, you know what, if you're gonna, our ad server needs to respond in this amount of time, or now, yeah. And so I've seen a lot of that in the SLA. Now, some of that gets depending on who has the power in that relationship, you know, because sometimes the third-party resource may have the clout, in which case they're just going to laugh at you. But, you know, if you can do it, it's actually a really nice way of ensuring that they do that. And I think the advertising industry comes to mind as like, if there was ever a place that needed to have that stuff in their SLAs, it's them. Somebody needs to covertly optimize an ad loading script without telling the advertiser, and then like do an A/B test and show them. I'm sure the results would, you know, you'd probably not get slapped too hard after, but somebody should do that.
That's the most expensive because of that.
Yeah, it's
wait
nasty.
time.
Yeah, it's pretty nasty. But yeah, you know, and I think that the reason why I think it's so important to have the continuing monitoring and the continual measurement is because there is a book about where ideas kind of come from, and one of the things that and how all of our ideas come from, you know, like bouncing off of other people's ideas and people that are learning things before us. You know, no idea lives in a vacuum, right? Like my idea isn't really my idea; it's everybody's idea that I've taken in a different direction. But one of the points he makes in the book repeatedly is that when you measure things and you get to a point where you're able to measure something that you weren't able to measure before, say speed index, which is starting to get into perceived performance. Every time you improve your measuring and your monitoring of something, you see leaps very shortly after in terms of how you understand and how well you can accomplish those tasks. Like measuring provides so much value and tends to leap people forward as you improve that. So it's so important to get those metrics recorded some way that you're watching them. Yeah.
Do most of these tools like Speed Curve and web pages, I did a quick search and it looks like there are some ways with web page tests, but most of the complexities I think that we would want to be monitoring are behind login, right? You're talking about the bank, and so it seems like web page tests might be able to send
web page
some
tests
stuff,
could.
but-
Yeah, web page tests could. I don't know that I've done it through Speed Curve, but I'd be surprised if you couldn't.
Okay.
Because it's sitting on top of the web page test API. So all Mark has to do is be exposing in some way. In fact, you might be able to do it in the setup. It's been so long since I set that account up. But you may be able to, right in there, do the same things in web page tests where you're defining what the URL is, what the password, username, you know, ways to get past.
Like submit some, I mean, because it's not Apache authentication.
No,
it's
right,
like,
it could be,
username, password, so.
Yeah, so there's a whole scriptable interface on top of web page tests. It's just a matter of how much he's exposed inside of Speaker.
Okay, I
Yep.
gotcha.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, we've got, what, 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna go beyond load just really quick because I think this is super important. We haven't talked about it at all. Everything we've been talking about so far has been load time. This is at the end, not because it's less important, it's at the end because this is the area that we need the biggest improvements in right now in terms of tooling and monitoring because they just don't exist. We talked about these response time limits. In the 100 milliseconds, I just want to kind of hammer this home a little bit. That doesn't sound like very much at all. 100 milliseconds, or you know, if you're making improvements of 50 milliseconds, or when you start to get into some of the animation stuff, you know, 16 milliseconds they're talking about. Like those times, to us they sound a little extreme. But we're really susceptible to delays in that stuff. This is a video from an experiment using Oculus Rift. And these people walked around with this thing on their face. And what it did is it introduced 300 milliseconds of lag. That's it. 300 milliseconds of lag in what they were seeing. And So they walked around for a day doing all of these things, seeing everything 300 milliseconds after it actually occurred, which is not a huge amount, but you can see that the results were hilarious for us watching, maybe not so much for the person who got ran over. But it's a big impact that it has on us. And so when we start to get into these other areas, like how quickly things respond, how smoothly they're scrolling, and we're starting to talk about these fractions of a second, it does matter significantly. Paul Lewis and Paul Irish from Google have been very recently started to promote their view of this, which they're calling RAIL, response, animation, idle, load. So we've talked about load quite a bit, right? Load time, and that's all this performance budget that we've discussed. Response time would be things like if you're tapping on a button or you've got a light box popping up or whatever it happens to be. That's falling back on that instantaneous feel. You want that happening within 100 milliseconds or less. That's a good target for that. So that's technically a budget. That's a budget for those response times. Unfortunately, try to automate that. That's not, unless you're using, there's telemetry, which is a Chrome thing, but it requires you have your own version, like your own installation of Chromium and your script. It's not a very easy thing to do. You could technically automate some of the testing that way, but that's about it. We talked about load. That's our 1,000 milliseconds of state of flow. That's our speed index or whatever we've happened to have identified for our budget. There's animation performance, how smoothly things scroll, and we know we want that 60 frames per second feels very silky smooth. You don't notice any jank, you don't notice any scrolling, and this does have a measurable impact on user experience, by the way. We talked about Facebook cutting it in half to 30 frames per second, and their engagement dropped, it plummeted. Pinterest had similar reactions. I want to say that Etsy, I can't remember the stat, but I want to say Etsy at one point identified that this was potentially more impactful on their business than anything related to load, which is interesting. But if you're hitting 60 frames per second, that means you are hitting over the course of 1,000 milliseconds, you have to go 60 frames. You have about 16 milliseconds to handle your little bursts of activity, which is not a lot of time. Again, you can't really monitor it that well. There's just nothing other than telemetry, which does some smooth scrolling things, but is difficult. Your best bet is to do this manually. Things like Chrome DevTools, which you see here, they plot out very clearly when you're up above that 60 frame or 30 frame per second target, and you can drill in and figure out what is causing that delay. Why is that scroll janky? So that's your animation and scrolling performance, and then you have the idle performance, is what they're calling this other one. This one needs a little bit more explanation. Load makes sense. You go to a page, it loads, that's your load. Instant or interaction, what you want to be instant, the response time, thank you. When you're tapping on something makes sense because you're obviously clicking on forms and expanding navigation and collapsing navigation, all of that is the responsive. If you look at the scrolling is obviously something you're constantly doing on a page and all those animations that might occur. All of those things are very easy for us to identify what it means in terms of a web experience. But if you think about, again, looking throughout an entire flow of a page or entire flow of a series of pages, there's also a lot of time where you're idle. You're not doing anything. You're reading content, right? You're doing something pretty simple and basic. Paul Squared, looked into this, and I'm sure other people at Google, and realized that this is a great time to take care of some of the stuff a little bit proactively. Like if you have constantly running scripts or you have other things that you want to load a little bit ahead of time, if you do it in these little buckets during the idle time, you can do it in a way that's not going to interfere with the scrolling, it's not going to interfere with the response times or anything like that. But you have to do it in little bursts. They say 50 milliseconds, which is not much time, because if you have a long-running thing, you have a script that runs on timeout or on interval and is doing comprehensive tasks, and it takes a long time to execute, more than 50 milliseconds to do whatever it's doing, that's going to interfere with the scrolling. That's going to interfere with your animation performance. So all of those sorts of things, you want to try to get in and out as quickly as possible, 50 milliseconds or less. So the way they do it, their rail performance budget or rail performance goals looks like this. They have a response time budget, an animation time budget, idle budget, and load budget. Load budget is what we've been referring to the rest of the time. I think this is the next step. I think this makes a lot of sense from a perspective of analyzing and understanding the full experience. I think we also have a long way to go before monitoring response, animation, and idle is as easy as keeping tabs on as performance budget. The tools just aren't there yet. They're going to be there, I have faith, but they're not there yet. But I wanted to bring this up because that's, if you're thinking about the web as an experience based of a series of interactions, all of these things come into play, not just how quickly the page loads.
So I know we talked about load, some perceived performance was brought up earlier, and in animation that's really big, right? So perceived visual performance is not just each frame completing, but it's the strobing effects, it's, you know, all those kind of things that get built into that. Have you had any conversations about that, or is it? I
haven't yet, but that's I think that's another one of those interesting areas for people to dive into a little bit more, and that's going to be huge. Like the animation side of things is and motion design in general is a huge area that is mostly unexplored in our industry, but absolutely needs to be explored in more detail because it's becoming more and more prevalent and more important, and it's a way that we can take advantage of some of the unique characteristics of an interactive experience. We have a long way to go on that. For that, I would say follow the work that Val Head is doing. Follow Rachel Neighbors, Kenneth Bowles, and read up. You know, do those three people are talking about it quite a bit. I'm sure I'm missing other people. Do a lot of reading into the traditional animation process. Not only is it fun, honestly it is. I love reading about like the cartoon animation stuff, like it's like a passion, it's so cool. But there's a lot of things that they figured out over the time in terms of how to make these things appeal in certain ways or move in certain ways that indicate different things. Those are lessons we absolutely can learn to apply back to the web. So go home and watch a lot of Looney Tunes. That's serious. And I did a presentation, and that was the best thing. Is I was down in my basement, and I was like watching Looney Tunes, and my wife would come in during the work hours, and she's like, "What are you doing?" "I'm working, honey. I'm working on my presentation." Bugs Bunny's helping. Yeah, it's a wildly unexplored area, but it's super interesting. So that's just, if you went out and ignored everything else that I said, your basic steps for a performance budget, if you boil it down, you just got to pick what you're going to monitor, define it based on your competitors or based on your own site or whatever it happens to be, come up with a budget, and then just find a way to enforce it. Make sure that it doesn't get left to chance, and that you're monitoring it and making sure that you're hitting that budget and staying within it and using it to inform your design and development. If you do those three things, then step 4 is basically looks like this. And I see you were trying to take a picture. I'll go back. You got the Jim Carrey thing instead. That's awesome. That's a great photobomb. But that's you get to celebrate, your users get to celebrate, and you all get to look ridiculous. If you want more information on this stuff, anybody that I mentioned over the course of this, Katie, Paul Irish, Lara, Filament Group, Dan Moll, Jacina Perez Cruz. Did I get her first name correct? Jasenia. Sorry, I feel bad. She gave an amazing talk at Smashing Conf about designing through the lens of a performance budget. Follow all those people. They're doing a lot of interesting stuff in this area and really paying attention to it. Read Lara's book. Read Scott Gell's book, Responsive Design. Check out this Slack group that's pretty sweet. There's a lot of really good discussion going on in there about people who are trying to figure this stuff out, as well as other performance issues. And selfish plug, but definitely check out the podcast that Katie and I have started that is all about the culture of performance, because it's going to get into a lot of these sorts of things, like how are other people at other companies selling it and defining budget and using them and things like that. Or just, ask me. I respond to emails sometimes kind of slowly, but Twitter I'm pretty quick on, so you can do that. Thank you for sticking through the morning session.
Thanks for watching the Build Right Maker Series. Check out our other videos from industry leaders at buildright.io. Or even better, buy a ticket and attend in person.